All right, welcome back, committee members. And we will now begin consideration of Bill number 209, the Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive Act, Clause 1, short title. Minister Harrison is here with his official, and I'd ask that officials please state their names before speaking at the microphone. And Minister Harrison, you begin by introducing your officials and making your opening remarks on this bill.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Madam Chair. And only have one official accompanying me today, Deputy Minister Kent Campbell, Trade and Export Development. And I am pleased to be here this evening to discuss Bill 209, the Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive Act. As we announced in the budget, our government is introducing a new Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive. This incentive will be another tool to attract chemical fertilizer manufacturing facilities to Saskatchewan. It will encourage investment by providing a non-refundable corporate income tax credit. New investments will contribute to growth and diversification of the provincial economy, allowing the province to move beyond potash fertilizer production into product lines of value for farmers. This incentive is aligned with priorities set out in the Saskatchewan Plan for Growth to diversify core economic sectors. Furthermore, the new investments generated by this incentive will bring new corporate income tax and property tax revenues, as well as create jobs and increase opportunities for local supplier and service sales. The Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive is a non-refundable, non-transferable 15% tax credit on capital expenditures for newly constructed or expanded chemical fertilizer production facilities in Saskatchewan, making investments of at least $10 million. Companies apply the benefit against corporate income tax owing and are able to claim the benefit over a 10-year period once the new or expanded facility is brought into operation. Redemption of the tax credit will be limited to 20% in year 1, 30% in year 2, and 50% in year 3. There will be a maximum carry forward of 10 years on any remaining credit amount. In closing, the new incentive, as well as our other incentive programs, will help attract investment as we work towards economic recovery in Saskatchewan. And I would like to thank officials who've been working hard on this particular initiative and others identifying areas where new growth tax incentives make sense in conducting research and doing the modeling on which this specific initiative is based. And with that, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, committee members. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Minister. I'll open the floor to questions from members now, and I'll recognize Ms. Sproul.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for those opening comments. My first question tonight is, this is obviously a bill that you've been looking at for some time. I know when you produced the estimates in March that this was one of the bills that you were intending to introduce prior to COVID. Did the appearance of COVID cause any concern for you in terms of the advisability of introducing this tax incentive at this time?
No, it didn't. And I think, in fact, it made the logic behind this even more apparent in attracting new investment to the province. And like I said, we've been working on this for some period of time. Many months. Officials have been working on program design, and it's actually quite similar to the ag value-added incentive that members would have seen in the last budget. So this, and I would say this likely will not be the last either. We're looking at other options and examining other possibilities as well. So I'm not sure, Kent, if you want to add anything additional to that.
Maybe I would just add that we have had conversations with prospective investors, and they like the structure of this kind of a tax credit and the predictability of it. And we think it's a really competitive space, and we feel that Saskatchewan is a logical place to make this kind of investment. But unlike potash, there's not a natural resource here to build off of. So we knew we need to be very competitive on the incentive side. And
maybe if I could just add as well, I mean, there are incentives that exist in other jurisdictions in which we're competing for investment in this space. So Indiana, as an example, Illinois have incentive programs in place. So, ideally, I guess we, would just, prefer if companies were making investments on without having to look at incentives, but the reality is that jurisdictions that we're in a competitive place with are offering incentives, and we think this is an investment that should be made here in this province, and it makes sense that it is.
Just want to go back on something you just mentioned in terms of the feedstock. If I understand correctly, potash would not be the primary feedstock for these types of fertilizers. Where would the feedstock come from, and what would it be?
Yes, Kent Campbell, Deputy Minister. So the idea behind the incentive is that potash on its own, or just in a strict blend, wouldn't be eligible because we already have a royalty and taxation regime that takes care of that. So any other process that combines it in a chemical process, so it could use potash as part of that, but it would have to be more than just blending it. It would have to go through some sort of a chemical manufacturing process where each individual nodule of fertilizer would have potash, nitrogen, phosphorus, or whatever else other micronutrients might be the case.
So just to be sure, in Hanley, I know the co-op recently opened a fertilizer depot, I guess. I'm not sure if that's the right word for it. Would they qualify for this type of incentive, what they're doing there?
I don't believe so. I'd need to know more information, but they're simply mixing product. That would not qualify. It would have to be a chemical manufacturing process.
I think they're just mixing at this point in time. All right. In terms of the empirical research that you did, you say you've been working on this for some time. What types of research did you do, and what led you to believe that this was the best type of incentive that should come forward in this year's budget?
So one of the things we like about it is that it's not an ongoing incentive, right? So it's you make the capital investment, you get the credit, you can apply it over 10 years, but it's not an ongoing annual subsidy or anything like that. It's a one-time investment. We also like the fact that you don't actually qualify until you've actually completed and commissioned your facility. So we will give you an initial preliminary approval, but then you don't actually get the tax credit until that facility is complete and commissioned. So we like that aspect of it. We've also had relatively positive feedback on the value-added agriculture incentive, which this was modeled under. And so we think it's an effective program from those some of those perspectives.
Maybe if I could just add to that as well, just so that those who are following along, as far as how the tax credit actually works in this isn't a expenditure on the part of the government of Saskatchewan. What it is foregone revenue on tax owing. So what that means is that there would first have to be an investment of over $10 million, all the jobs that are associated with that. The business itself would have to be a going concern with income tax owing, and that income tax would essentially be foregone at the rate of 15% of the capital expenditure. So there's actually no outlay on the part of the people of the province. It's simply foregone tax revenue that would never have happened but for the incentive being in place in the first instance.
Assuming they wouldn't have set up their capital operations here without the incentive. Right. So I know we've talked about the film employment tax credit in a way, and can you, what's the difference between this type of tax incentive and one on employment in terms of generating economic activity?
Well, just with regard to, I'm comfortable kind of getting into the details of this statute, but questions on that would probably be best put to Minister Mikowski.
Right, thank you. So what sort of empirical research was conducted? How did you go about researching that this was the best way? You said you liked it, but what led you to like it? What sort of studies did you do? What sort of research did you do?
So a lot of it was research based upon what other jurisdictions are providing. And so the minister noted some incentives we were aware of in the United States. We also know that when it comes to these types of facilities, corporate tax rate is an important consideration. And if you look at two of our most competing jurisdictions, Alberta, who's now moved to a 10% corporate tax rate as of January 1st, and the state of North Dakota has a corporate tax rate of between 4% and 5%. Now, their federal rate's a little bit higher, but when you combine those, that would be a lower tax rate than we have here. And then another logical competing jurisdiction is Manitoba, who has similar corporate tax rate structure to us, But they are more competitive on hydro prices, generally speaking, for industry. And so the fact that we are aware of those incentives and some of the other competitiveness factors, and the fact that the value-added agriculture incentive has been quite popular, led us to make the recommendation on this particular incentive.
I want to get to a question about the value-add agriculture incentive in a bit, but are there any other industries, like other than chemical fertilizer, that you looked at in terms of providing this incentive to?
We've considered other sectors. The ones that make the most sense for us were around value-added agriculture and adding value to fertilizer. So if you look at the some of the major economic export drivers, the places where we're kind of on the map globally anyway, making sure that we were competitive in those areas. But certainly, like the minister mentioned, we are always looking at where we're competitive and where we can do better to attract more investment.
So there were really no other options that came to you at that time, like chemical fertilizer was the one and only thing?
Well, I would just say that, from the competitive perspective and the very large volumes of investment that are at stake in this area, where one investment decision can be worth, literally hundreds of millions of dollars, that being in a competitive position with our neighbors to the east and west and to the south, where there is a limited number of these facilities that will be constructed in the next decade, for us to be competitive, and we should be in that space, we needed to be in the position to offer an incentive of this nature to be competitive. And we're very hopeful that we're going to, because of this, see significant investment decisions. We don't know that for sure, but we have seen uptake on the ag value-added incentive, which is a similar policy rationale as to why we are in that field, as to why we're in this one, where we have a globally competitive position where there are very large investment decisions where this can make the difference.
Have you looked at any potential incentives in the livestock industry at all?
I think in terms of one of the targets in the growth plan is to increase our protein production in both on the meat side as well as the plant protein side. And so when it comes to manufacturing processes, I mean, that's something we could always consider for sure.
In terms of creating a competitive space, that could easily be wiped out if our neighbors to the east and west and south initiated a similar tax incentive. So it's almost a race to the bottom in some ways when you look at competitive rates, and it just drives rates further and further down, resulting, of course, in less taxes for the government. Is this, I just think of our corporate tax rate. I remember the finance minister a couple of years ago reduced it for small businesses, saying it was the lowest in Canada, but all it would take is for another jurisdiction to beat us to that and go lower. So what sort of race are we in here? Is it a dangerous race to be in when we're trying to create a competitive space, and yet by doing so, it's just inviting other jurisdictions to beat us?
I don't know if I would agree with that premise. We haven't seen that in other areas with the ag value-added incentive, for example. Could provinces, other jurisdictions do something similar? I suppose they could. We haven't seen that sort of policy response, though, from other jurisdictions. Alberta does have measures in place in this particular space right now that are different. Would they copy this exact program? I'm not sure. I mean, they've copied some of our pandemic-related programming, but which is a possibility. But I don't think I would agree with the overall premise that you end up seeing a race to the bottom in a competitive taxation environment, because for a variety of reasons, but I think jurisdictions understand you do get to a point where it just doesn't make sense for your jurisdiction to make any further changes. So, they might have a different program that incentivizes a different niche of a particular space. But I wouldn't see that being the logical policy response.
If I'm not wrong, I think corporate tax rates have been in decline across Canada for many years, and they're probably the lowest they've ever been. So I'm not sure if that isn't a good reason to think that it might be a downward spiral, if not a race to the bottom.
I mean, this is kind of obiter of the discussion that we're having, but but that being said, I mean, you have seen corporate income tax rates go up and down in different jurisdictions based on different local political circumstances as well. So
You may want to debate that in an economy class or something like that. In terms of the value-add ag incentive, if I understand correctly, there's interest, but there hasn't been any actual investments made in relation to that particular incentive. Is that correct?
The program launched on September 20th of 2018. We've had 8 investors receive conditional approvals. And so that they basically submitted plans that we say, yes, meets the criteria. And of those 8, they are, I would say, in various stages of progress. So some are actually constructing, some are still in the concept phase. But none have been completed, and therefore no tax credits have yet been announced or provided for. And so that'll wait till the completion of those projects. They will then submit a document that will get the final approval, and then they'll be able to apply the tax credit. So there's 8 conditional approvals at this stage.
This too is a bit obiter, but can you tell us which ones are actually constructing at this point?
For commercial confidentiality reasons, we do keep that, and we don't want to upset companies that are in the process of considering making decisions. But once those are complete, the expectation is that we would have an announcement around those projects.
Okay, thank you. Just one other question, I think, is I'm wondering if any chemical fertilizer companies have lobbied the government in terms of this incentive.
We've talked to different producers of fertilizer about potentially investing in Saskatchewan, both those that are already present in Saskatchewan and those that have a presence in other countries. And much like we've promoted the value-added agriculture incentive as a concept, we've asked for feedback in terms of that type of a program. So we have had discussions with there's probably 3 to 5 companies we've had conversations with.
And can you tell us whether they came to you or whether you approached them?
So we've been seeking investment from them. And we designed this program based upon the value-added agriculture incentive, which we have in place.
All right, Madam Chair, that's the extent of my questions for this evening.
Okay, seeing no further questions, we will move to vote off this bill. Clause 1, short title. Is that agreed? Carried. Clause 2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 8, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 9, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 10, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 11, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 12, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 13, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 14, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 15, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 16, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 17, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 18, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 19, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 20, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 21, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 22, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 23, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 24, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 25, coming into force, is that agreed? Carried. Her Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, enacts as follows the Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive Act. I would ask a member to move that we report Bill number 209, the Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive Act, without amendment. Mr. Stewart so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Minister, if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make.
I have a lengthy speech I'd like to make, Madam Chair. Kidding. Just want to say thank you to you, Madam Chair, and committee members, Deputy Minister Campbell, and my friend from Nutana for the questions.
And Ms. Sproul, if you have anything you'd like to say as a closing?
Just likewise, thank you to the minister and the official for being here tonight, and to Committee Hansard, and congratulations on the good work. Thank you.
The minister and his officials may leave now if they like, because we will now proceed to voting off the committee resolutions on estimates. And it's a long one, Kathy, so hang on. Sorry. All right, we will now proceed to voting off the committee resolutions for the 2020-21 estimates and 2019-20 supplementary estimates. Vote 1, Agriculture. Central Management and Services Subvote AG01 in the amount of $11,716,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. You've got them. I don't have them. Okay. Okay.
6 feet, yeah.
Tough to do when you got a hand paper. Okay. Industry Assistance Subvote AG03 in the amount of $3,889,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Okay. Land Management Subvote AG04 in the amount of $4,913,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Policy Trade and Value-Added Subvote AG05 in the amount of $5,846,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Research and Technology Subvote AG06 in the amount of $32,958,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Regional Services Subvote AG07 in the amount of $32,026,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Not sure I'm looking at the right figures here. Program Subvote AG09 in the amount of $25,511,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Business Risk Management Subvote AG10 in the amount of $244,330,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Non-appropriated expense adjustment in the amount of $2,667,000. Non-appropriated expense adjustments are non-cash adjustments presented for informational purposes only. No amount is to be voted. Oh, right. Agriculture, vote 1, $361,189,000. Across the top again, right? I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2021, the following sums for agriculture in the amount of $361,189,000.
That the 8th report of the standing.
No, you just say.
Sorry, I agree. I so move.
I so move.
Sorry.
Mr. Steele so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. And, no, yeah. On agriculture, right? Yeah. Why red? I can hardly see that. Okay, now we have to go to the next group here. Vote 23, Energy and Resources. Central Management and Services, subvote ER01 in the amount of $20,111,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Oh, yeah, that's the first one. It's this one here. Okay. Energy Regulation, subvote ER05 in the amount of $163,406,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Resource Development, subvote ER06 in the amount of $41,351,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Non-appropriated expense adjustment in the amount of $3,568,000. Non-appropriated expense adjustments are non-cash adjustments presented for informational purposes only, and no amount is to be voted. Energy and Resources, vote 23, $224,868,000. Back to the beginning. Yep. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2021, the following sums for energy and resources in the amount of $224,868,000. I so move.
I so move.
Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. I'm working on it.
It's gonna take a couple more night classes.
Vote 26, Environment, Central Management and Services, subvote EN01 in the amount of $17,055,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried.
That is a paperless society.
Yeah. Well. Climate Change and Adaptation, subvote EN06 in the amount of $7,247,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Fish, Wildlife and Land, subvote EN07 in the amount of $14,860,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Compliance and Field Services, subvote EN08 in the amount of $19,883,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Forest Service, subvote EN09 in the amount of $7,764,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Environmental Protection, subvote EN11 in the amount of $42,976,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Non-appropriated expense adjustment in the amount of $2,612,000. Non-appropriated expense adjustments are non-cash adjustments presented for informational purposes only. No amount is to be voted. Environment, vote 26, $109,785,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2021, the following sums for environment in the amount of $109,785,000.
I so move.
Mr. Steele, so moves. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried.
I'm spending a lot of money here, Doug.
Geez, yeah, I'm not counting for this.
Well, Lyle could chip in too there, a few bucks. Vote 16, Highways and Infrastructure, Central Management and Services, subvote HI01 in the amount of $17,563,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Next page. Preservation of Transportation System, subvote HI04 in the amount of $116,862,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Transportation Planning and Policy, subvote excuse me, HI06 in the amount of $3,466,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. It's getting dry. Infrastructure and Equipment Capital Subvote HI08 in the amount of $411,083,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Custom Work Activities Subvote HI09 in the amount of $0. Is that agreed? Carried. Operation of Transportation System Subvote HI10 in the amount of $127,796,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Strategic Municipal Infrastructure Subvote HI15 in the amount of $38,217,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Non-appropriate expense adjustment in the amount of $225,877,000. Non-appropriate expense adjustments are non-cash adjustments presented for informational purposes only. No amount is to be voted. Highways and Infrastructure Vote 16, $714,987,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2021, the following sums for highways and infrastructure in the amount of $714,987,000.
So, sorry, loud. Oh, I didn't jump
Mr. Steele so moves. Is that agreed?
in. Agreed.
Carried.
Sorry, not-
I'm just looking to see if he was
I'm
still,
trying to be keener now.
see if he was still awake.
Teacher tells you
Vote 16, Highways and Infrastructure, Central Oh, we jumped.
Turn the page. Immigration and career.
Oh, right. Vote 89, Immigration and Career Training, Central Management and Services Subvote IC01 in the amount of $22,543,000. Is that agreed? Carried. That page. Immigration, Employment and Career Development Subvote IC02 in the amount of $11,415,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Training and Employer Services Subvote IC03 in the amount of $5,878,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Labor Market Program Subvote IC04 in the amount of $135,641,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Non-appropriated expense adjustment in the amount of $1,155,000. Non-appropriated expense adjustments are non-cash adjustments presented for informational purposes only. No amount is to be voted. Immigration and Career Training, Vote 89, $175,477,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2021, the following sums for immigration and career training in the amount of $175,477,000.
So move.
Mr. Stewart so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Innovation Saskatchewan, Vote 84. Innovation Saskatchewan, Subvote IS01 in the amount of $25,727,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Page. Innovation Saskatchewan, Vote 84, $25,727,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2021, the following sums for Innovation Saskatchewan in the amount of $25,727,000.
I so move.
Mr. Stewart so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. We're getting there, guys. I'm just going to lose these off the floor. Vote 35, Saskatchewan Research Council. Saskatchewan Research Council, subvote SR01 in the amount of $35,108,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Saskatchewan Research Council, vote 35, $35,108,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2021, the following sums for Saskatchewan Research Council in the amount of $35,108,000.
So moved.
Mr. Stewart so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Vote 86. 86, SAS Builds Corporation. SAS Builds Corporation, subvote SB01 in the amount of $24,251,000. Is that agreed? Carried. SAS Builds Corporation, vote 86, $24,251,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolved that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2021, the following sums for SAS Builds Corporation in the amount of $24,251,000.
So moved.
Mr. Stewart so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. All right, getting there. Vote 90, Trade and Export Development. Central Management and Services subvote TE01 in the amount of $5,536,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Strategic Policy and Competitiveness subvote TE02 in the amount of $2,703,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Economic Development subvote TE03 in the amount of $9,096,000. Is that agreed? Carried. International Engagement subvote TE04 in the amount of $9,615,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Trade and Export Development vote 90, $26,950,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2021, the following sums for trade and export development in the amount of $26,950,000.
So I so moved.
Mr. Stewart so moves. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Man, how many of these did we do? Vote 87, Water Security Agency. Water Security Agency, subvote WS01 in the amount of $70,506,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Water Security Agency, vote 87, $70,506,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2021, the following sums for Water Security Agency in the amount of $70,506,000.
So moved.
Mr. Stewart so moves. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Vote 197, SAS Builds Corporation, statutory. Loans, subvote BC01 in the amount of $900,000. There is no vote as this is statutory. And you want me to sign here too? Almost. Supplementary, these are the supplementary estimates, 2019-20. Vote 01, Agriculture. Business Risk Management, subvote AG10 in the amount of $8,200,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Agriculture vote 01, $8,200,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2020, the following sums for agriculture in the amount of $8,200,000.
So moved.
Mr. Stewart so moves. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Supplementary estimates 2019-20, vote 26, environment, climate change and adaptation, subvote EN06 in the amount of $4,500,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Wildlife management, subvote EN10 is in the amount of $170 million. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Environment, vote 26, $174,500,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to Her Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2020, the following sums for environment in the amount of $174,500.
I so move.
Mr. Stewart so moves. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Supplementary estimates 2019-20, vote 197, SAS Builds Corporation statutory. Loans, subvote BC01 in the amount of $8 million. There is no vote as this is statutory. Stickers there. Committee members, you have before you a draft of the 8th report of the Standing Committee on the Economy. We require a member to move the following motion, that the 8th report of the Standing Committee on the Economy be adopted and presented to the Assembly.
That the 8th report of the Standing Committee on the Economy be adopted and presented to the Assembly.
Mr. Steele so moves. Mr. Steele has moved that the 8th report of the Standing Committee on the Economy be adopted and presented to the Assembly. Is that agreed? Carried. That one.
Sign date and rights carried on there. I know
She's
it's
already
written.
got
Yeah,
it.
it's written, but we
You-
need it. Yeah.
oh.
Sign date and rights carried. So it's moved.
That's
And I need you to sign this one as well.
all right. That concludes our business for today. I would ask a member to move a motion of adjournment. Mr. Stewart so moves. All agreed. This committee stands adjourned to the call of the chair. Finally. Now I got to sign all that.